Couser and the Oliver today. So let's make sure we have read through pages 55 to 91 from the Couser book and pages 76 to 91 in the Oliver book. And I'll go through this, and then, as always, I want to hear your response, your feedback, your thoughts. Let's start with Couser, and let's go over to page 55 and talking about writing better feelings. And this is such an important thing to talk about, because one thing that I get from students most often when we talk about why we write poems is because we want to express our feelings. This is a very legit response. I am in no way disparaging this. We see poetry as potentially cathartic, as potentially therapeutic. This is a chance for us to get feelings across in a way that maybe we can't. And if we can share those poems with those feelings expressed, maybe we can help somebody else who has similar feelings and can relate to what we're going through. These are noble, honorable, understandable things. I am in no way going to rip these things up. Neither does Couser. But what's important is that we think about how we express those emotions, how we express those feelings. Because one of the problems that happens with poems is that they end up being too sentimental. They end up being maudlin and excessive in the feelings that they're trying to express. We've talked about this in class. We've talked about this idea of striving for sentiment, but not sentimentality. And I think Couser does an excellent job in this section of talking about that. This idea, if we can talk about on page 56, that a useful definition of sentimentality. This is on the first paragraph that starts with Leonard Nathan's name after the break on page 56. He said sentimentality is a kind of disproportion between excessive feelings and its object. An example might be a poem in which an excessive amount of emotion is lavished on a floor lamp. Now that would seem excessive if it's a parody. I think that's something else. But then we'll think, well, what about if I'm expressing a poem about the loss of my grandfather? Isn't that a situation in which it is fair and reasonable for me to feel an excessive amount of emotion for the person that I'm speaking to? Of course it is. But you still have to keep it reasonable. You have to make sure that somebody can relate. You don't want it to feel like you're expressing emotion in a way that's just about calling attention to the emotion. If you have too disproportionate a balance between the sentiment and the object, to use this definition from Leonard Nathan, then what you end up with is a poem that's more about the feeling and the speakers and the poets through that response to the feeling than it is about the subject. So even if you're writing about your late grandfather, then yeah, in that case you do get to express more feeling than you do for the floor lamp in the earlier example, because you probably felt more for your grandfather than you did the floor lamp. But even in that case, you can go too far. We can end up with the feelings feeling insincere. Right? If we go to 59, he talks about sentimentality can happen when a poet adds language. I jump in. I'm so excited to read these great quotes. I jump in too quickly. This is on the paragraph that begins with, here's another way of thinking about expressions of feelings. Actually, why don't I read that whole paragraph, because I think it's great here. Here's another way of thinking about expression of feelings. A poem is an object constructed of words, and when this object is presented to its readers, it is theirs to respond to however they wish. This is where we get into challenges with sentimentality, right? Is that we need to make sure that our poems exist as something that someone else can interpret. Sometimes they'll interpret it in a way that we intended, sometimes they won't. If they end up interpreting it in a way that we did not intend, that we think is harmful to what our intentions of the poem is, then we probably want to do something about that. If they're in the ballpark, then we're probably not too worried about it, right? By carefully selecting the details, the poet can guide this response to some degree. For example, if into a scene a poet puts a blind child, the reader's response can be expected to be appropriate. So if we're writing a poem and a blind child's in it, then the reader can have a response. And that response is probably going to be what we intended. All we've done in this scenario is we've presented the idea of this image within the poem. And now the reader can do with that image what he or she wants. Can the reader see that as sentimental? Maybe, but we haven't done that yet. All we've done in the scenario is we put it into the scene of a poem. Sentimentality can happen when a poet adds language, often excessive modifiers, in an attempt to force a response. So instead of saying the blind child, um, I saw the blind child walking down the street. Instead of saying that, I say that poor, miserable blind child with his wee white cane. Do you see what's happened there? That I've gone from letting an image carry itself and be led in a way that the reader can interpret however they want, to here's what you're supposed to feel. That poor, miserable blind child with his wee white cane. Look at that detail I've added here, and the modifiers that I've added to make you feel a certain way. That's where we get into sentimentality. Basically, a poet can avoid sentimentality by giving the reader credit for knowing how to respond to something without being led by the nose. Poems that work best are poems in which we don't have to lead the reader along, that the reader is able to follow along what we've provided by just stating the basic information. It's so hard for us as writers sometimes to be okay with that. We want to make sure that readers feel certain ways, and we can help with that by providing those images. But there comes a point that if we do too much to lead our reader, the reader will feel manipulated, essentially. We don't want that. We got to make sure that we find a way for the reader to not feel manipulated and to instead feel like things have been emotionally earned. Going on to page 60, one of the hardest things to learn, this is after that poem, one of the hardest things to learn is how poems can express strong feelings without expressly stating those feelings. Part of the problem is that in everyday conversation, we often quite freely make statements about feelings. The kid's goldfish died and they really felt bad. In this effective poem, nowhere, and this is the earlier one, nowhere is there a statement of feeling unless we want to fasten upon the rather weak. No one wants to lift it. The poem begins with description and follows description all the way through. We don't need to fill in those different aspects of the poem because the poem itself should get it, but it's hard, right? That we have to figure out how poems can express strong feelings. We want our poems to express feelings. We want our reader to feel something, hopefully something that we intend them to feel based on what's going on in the poem. But we can't tell them what they're supposed to feel. And we can't do that because if we do, it's going to feel like we're manipulating their emotions, and nobody wants that, right? I get very cynical sometimes when I watch entertainments, but I feel that at times that I'll be watching something or reading something, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is what they want me to feel. I'm going to rebelliously decide to dramatically not feel that thing. And maybe not everyone does that, but I think savvy readers can feel when they're being manipulated. And so if there's a poem about my dying or past grandfather, and everything is about very explicit, is filled with very explicit modifiers. It's very much about the emotional response, then it's not going to be effective. If we're writing about the kid's goldfish dying, maybe it's less effective, maybe not ineffective, but less effective to tell the reader how the child felt and instead express what the child did. I had this episode happen to me back in December. Christmas Eve, if you can believe the fates would do this to me, one of my daughter's 2 gerbils died. And I could say she was sad, because she was. I could say that she was inconsolable in terms of that. I could. What I could also say is, in a poem, I could describe the look on her face when she realized what had happened to the gerbil. I could talk about the way that she expressed her pain as opposed to just saying she was sad. That doesn't mean much in this situation. So you want to make sure that you get that across. We got through it. It was rough. We miss Dennis deeply. That was the gerbil's name. The other gerbil is still around. We've got to find a friend for him. That's Guy Raz. And if you know what the Guy Raz reference is, you can learn something about my 8-year-old and the type of mentality she has, that she named her gerbil Guy Raz. So this is what we're talking about with sentimentality. I would love to talk more about this. So if you have thoughts about these ideas of writing about our feelings, please post them below. This is such an important issue, and it's such an important thing to get into that I want to make sure that we can express this a little bit more. So if you have some further thoughts on this issue, please share them. I would love to hear more about how you're feeling on this idea of writing about your feelings and how to get it across, and how have you tried tried to address this? Have you tried to address it? And what more can we do to get these ideas and points across? So let's jump into the Oliver for a minute, then we'll get back to Kuzer. So let's go to page 76 and talk a little bit about diction, tone, and voice. And let's talk about what these things are and discuss how they help us and what they do for us. Diction, tone, and voice. Very similar things that will help us. You know, one of the things that I want us to do with this class is to create tools in our toolbox that we'll be able to use going forward to help ourselves know what to do in a given poem. And when we're talking about diction, we're talking about word choice. You've got to make sure that you're using the best word choice at the best moment. So when we're talking about your diction here, that's what we mean. You're trying to make sure that the poem has the right word choice at the right moment. You might not know what the proper word choice is until we have fully understood the tone and voice of the poem. So let's talk about what those are. The tone of the poem is the overall effect of the language that you're using. So as Oliver tells us, the overall effect of the diction in the poem creates the tone. One way to think about this is, what is the attitude that this poem is trying to convey? Is it tonally sad? Is it tonally happy? Is it upbeat? Is it something else? That's the tone of the poem. In order to kind of create this tone, you need a voice. And I want us to think about the voice as being the attitude expressed from the speaker into the content of the poem. So when I talk about a poem's voice, we're talking about how is the speaker functioning within the world of this poem. And she uses the word persona here. And when we talk about persona, what we mean is who is telling the poem and what is the sort of characterization of the speaker of the poem. Remember, as we've talked about in great detail, the speaker of the poem is not the writer of the poem. The speaker of the poem is a construct that the writer has put together in order to tell the story of the poem. Now, this might feel kind of odd because you might write poems that are very much about you, and you are the speaker, and you envision yourself as a speaker. That's fine. I do that. We all do that. Not every poem that we write is very deliberately from the perspective of a made-up character that we have created for the point of telling this poem. But it's still a construct. Even if you are writing in a persona that is much like you, we can still call it that. We can still call it a construct that exists for the purpose of telling this poem, even if it is very much related to you. It's still not quite you, right? It still might have some levels that you can use at those moments, and I think that's okay. So when we're talking about diction, we want to make sure that we're really thinking about what the words are that we're using and how they're functioning. I've made us think in great detail, and Oliver and Kuzer have helped me out on this discussion. But we spent a lot of time making sure that we think about each word at the end of lines and how each line is functioning. But I want us to go further with that and think about each word. Poems can be intimidating in this way, but you have to make sure that you are thinking very deliberately about how each word is going to function within the context of the poem. And if a word shouldn't be there, then we get it out. And you need to work your way through the poem to make sure that it is living up to the voice and the tone that are being created as well. So it's not a small thing here to think about this in these tones and in these manners. So you've got to make sure that you're using the right word in every situation. How do you know that? Well, you think about it. You go through, you revise your poems, you read your poems, you make sure that you have an economy of language that is deliberately only what you need within the context of a poem, even a longer poem. And then you're making sure that you have a sense of language that is in the best interest of what the poem needs to do. And this section does a really great job with talking about these different elements. If you have some specific things that are in here, let's talk about them and let's get into them. Let's go to page 80 and talk about negative capability. I'm just going to read through this section and kind of stop and talk about certain things because I think they're worth getting into. It's a very simple concept that seems very complicated. Negative capability is not a contemporary concept. This is the bottom of page 80, but a phrase originating with John Keats. His idea was, simply but momentously, that the poet should be a kind of negative force. that only by remaining himself negative or in some way empty is the poet able to fill himself with an understanding of or sympathy for or empathy with the subject of the poem. So what Keats is saying here is that a poet should start with kind of creating the poet as an empty vessel that can then lead that will allow the poem to be led to whatever the poem needs in that moment. Here's a passage from a letter to his brothers in which he discusses it. So this is Keats. It struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, in which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean, negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after the fact and reason. So this idea that the poet can begin writing a poem not being sure of where the poem's going. That the poet does not have to be filled with complete reason and understanding. That, in fact, a poet should be filled with uncertainties, mysteries, doubts. And he goes on. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine isolated verisimilitude, caught by the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. This pursued through volumes would perhaps take us no further than this, but that with the great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes all other considerations, or rather obliterates all other considerations. So if you kind of go into a poem with thinking of yourself as a blank vessel, with an idea that needs to be pursued, then that idea is going to be the thing that will drive the poem forward. There can be personas and things that exist within the poem, but the poem has to be a thing that is being created without the poet necessarily deliberately manipulating it. Does that make sense? Keats elsewhere writes of taking part in the life of the sparrow pecking crumbs at his window. A poet is the most unpoetical thing is the most poetical of anything in existence, because he has no identity. He is continually in for and filling some other body. So Keats's argument here is that a poet shouldn't be a poetic figure. The poet is the vessel through which poems can be created, but the poet themselves should not necessarily have to drive any of that, because the poet is able to create something without having to feel that thing within. I know it's kind of a strange concept, but let's keep going, because she talks so well about Keats. Neither was Keats bothered by the categories of animate and inanimate. His friend Richard Woodhouse records that Keats claimed he could conceive of a billiard ball, that it may have a sense of delight from its own roundness, smoothness, and very volubility, and the rapidity of its motion. So what this is getting into, and this is why it ties to negative capability, that Keats felt that he could take any object and give it this sense of delight, that can give it a sense of personality and creativity, because he himself didn't rely too much on his own self to create the poems. So from that rationale, we should be able to write a poem about a stapler that is undeniably about the stapler and nothing else. It's not about me as the poet. It's about the stapler, because negative capability allows me to step out of myself, because there is no self, and create the thing that needs to be created. So now, as then, the concept of negative capability goes to the heart of the matter. The mere diction of the poem at any age is the vehicle that holds, then transfers from the page to the reader an absolutely essential quality of real feeling. Poetry cannot happen within it, and no one talked about it more usefully and marvelously than Keats. His commentary is as up-to-date as the sunrise. So Keats's idea is that the poet ends up being sort of a negative space, a neutral space, that the poem fills with. The poem is not a neutral space. The poem fills with whatever the poem needs to be about. But the poet isn't bogging that down with things about the self. Make sense? We can still create personas. That's why what I said earlier about the persona of a poem being a construct, even if it feels like it's you, kind of makes sense, right? Because we can see ourselves through this lens of negative capability, and we can sort of create our own self without having to rely on ourselves. We'll talk. If this is confusing, talk about it below. It's one of those challenging things. I don't get to talk to you face to face with you immediately responding. But I'm really interested in what your thoughts are on this. Let's go a little bit more into types of poems. And we'll just hit these very quickly. And I'm curious, and I'd love for you to respond to this below too. What are types of poems that you feel like you're most interested in writing, that you'd like to write now? And which ones do you think are the most useful for you? The first one is a lyric. This is the most popular poem today. And we've read a lot of lyrics because we read. Oliver's book last week, her book of poems. It's a fairly brief lyric poem. By fairly brief, I mean 60 lines or so, and probably shorter. A glance into any current anthology will quickly show how many poems of this type and length are being written, compared with poems of great length or extreme brevity. So most poems that we read today are going to be somewhere between, generally 30 to 50 to 60 lines, right? And maybe sometimes less than that. But we don't see a lot of poems that are dramatically shorter than that. There aren't a ton that we'll encounter that are 2 to 3 to 10 lines. You've got your occasional haiku. But if we look at a general lit journal or something like that, we don't usually see that. The lyric poem is important. This is what a lyric poem is. It's brief, it's concentrated, has usually no more than a single subject in focus, and no more than a single voice, and is more likely to employ a simple and natural rather than an intricate or composed musicality. I like this. I like the way she describes it. It is not unlike a simple coiled spring, waiting to release its energy in a few clear phrases. So a lyric poem is a type of poem that is focused on a single idea or image and really isn't interested in meandering beyond that. We're going to talk about the meandering in the next one. So it's a coil ready to pop. Make sense? And we see that in her work. We see poems that are very much about a single, they're built on a single image. Might talk about internal responses, but it's about a single image. And that's where it ends. Right? That will end with a greater understanding of whatever that image is. Or maybe there's a couple of related images that are there, and we continue the focus on that. The narrative poem generally is longer, and it is not as tightly coiled, as she says. It is discursive, it pauses for moments of humor, perhaps slowly unfolding description. It sets an easy and readable pace. It helps us enjoy sequential events. This is a kind of poem that is very voice-driven, as what we've already talked about, that this is often coming from a writer who's wanting to tell a story of a thing that happened. So while we can look at Oliver's work as being that tight coil, we can see other poets that kind of move us in a different way. Let's see if I can find somebody who fits into that category. And if my poetry books were more reasonably organized, we'd be able to find something quite quickly. But so I'm going to include a poem under. Actually, let's see. I'm looking for a certain book that I don't see here. I'm going to include a poem here when I'm posting this video by Tony Hoagland, and we'll see how a writer can kind of create this sense of the narrative. And I want to use Hoagland because he uses some of that humor that we see, but there are a lot of narrative poems that are not sort of this playful contemporary thing that I'm going to share with you, and she uses a few. They tell stories, and sometimes they are very voice driven in that. Then there's a longer poem. She references epics, but it's not just about epic poems. It's about longer poems that are kind of going through a lot of things. It's not narrative because it isn't like a single story, but it's moving us through many, many things. Beowulf, the Iliad, the Odyssey, even some things like The Wasteland, which is modern, are doing this. But they're not always epic poems, and though Beowulf and Iliad and Odyssey certainly are, but sometimes a longer poem is just allowing the writer to sort of search for something in a way that maybe even a narrative poem doesn't quite allow. Finally, there is a prose poem, which is something that we've talked about a little bit. It's a style of poem that doesn't have line breaks and instead is sort of working as a small chunk of prose. It's sort of a hybrid between prose and poetry. And it's an interesting form, and I think it's worth kind of playing with because you don't have the line, but you still want to create the sense of a poem. So I definitely recommend that we play with that. In the last part of this section, she talks about inappropriate language, things we probably should avoid doing. And I think this is a good section for us to really think about because we want to be careful with poetic diction. And what that means are word choices that are made in order to make a poem sound like a poem. We want to be careful with this. This is something that we definitely see too often, that maybe the poem will end up feeling archaic or dated or just trite because it's trying so hard to sound like poems that existed years and years before. We want to make sure that we create a diction in a poem that is natural and challenging if we wanted to, but not archaic, not dated like that. Same with the cliche. Don't do it. Um, your poems should be bright and dynamic and feel new to the reader. It should make interesting moves and take chances and do things that surprise us. It shouldn't be cliche. Inversion is changing the normal word order. It isn't always going to be bad. Sometimes you can do really interesting things with this, but we don't want to do it just for the sake of doing it. We've got to make sure that if we are changing word order, if we're doing some interesting things, that we have a reason. That's all. Informational language. You can read from Oliver Stone, which really hates this. Informational language is language one would use if one were writing a paragraph on how to open or operate a can opener. Language that means to be crisp and accurate. Words are exact. We don't want to have cold and functional language. We want to have things that are bold and come to life. The language that's appropriate is to have proper syntax and proper grammar, which is something that sometimes we don't see in poems, and typically it is refreshing and worthwhile. And she also tells us that we want to be careful with too many adjectives and adverbs. There's things that end up kind of leading us in what we talked about before of manipulating the language of a poem into feeling like it has to be interpreted a certain way. And so we want to be careful. And as she ends this section, the caution, which she ended a previous chapter, language is vibrant, malleable, living material. In the writing of a poem, nothing, if it is done well and works to the desired effect, is wrong. So there are things that we can talk about as being stuff we should be more cautious about, but it doesn't mean that every time we would try to use a cliche or invert language that it's bad. Sometimes it's not. But you've got to understand what the poem is looking for in those situations. And obviously, we've been reading through for workshops and for the prompt, the cliche prompt, the idiom prompt a few weeks ago. And those are things built on cliche, but then pushing them in a different direction by having an awareness of what the cliche is. And so I think that's interesting when we can make that work. So in the rest of the section that we read for today from the Kuser book, he talks more about reading your poem through your poem and talking about sort of the stories of the poem and what's in the poem. And I think this is a very interesting thing that he's doing here. Let's kind of get into this. Let's go to 66. Enjoying a well-written poem, that's the first full paragraph, can be like going for a ride in a glass-bottomed boat. The poet deftly and confidently pilots the language, taking the reader across sometimes deep, sometimes cold, often colorful waters. The reader peers down the clear floor of the poem, down through the page upon which words have been printed with type and ink, a page now magically gone transparent into a fascinating realm revealed by the poem. The reader's experience in this world beneath the page is much like a dream, translate and timeless. His or her attention swims playfully along the waving grasses and mossy rocks of the poem until something, a pair of sunglasses, maybe suddenly clatters down upon the surface and spoils the moment. You don't want that to happen. So it's important, what he's saying here, is for the reader to be transported into a world of a poem without being rudely aware that it's a poem as it goes on. And so there are things that can happen within the world of the poem that can emulate that idea of dropping something on the glass. So it's important for us to try to stay very deliberate and specific when we've created a poem, and not to disrupt things unless what our goal is to disrupt them. And so that's what this section is kind of getting into. And again, I'd love your responses and thoughts on that. Finally, I want to take a look at writing from memory. That begins on page 73. And this is where a lot of the poems we write come from, right? Some of us have already shared things in workshops that are built on this idea of writing from memory. And when we're writing from memory, this is very much tied to what we just talked about earlier about emotion, is that you want to make sure that the story you're telling feels like it can carry weight beyond just what we're told, what we're telling the reader they need to feel. So when you're writing from memory, you don't have to worry about the 100% accuracy. We're creating a poem. We can create personas for that poem. It doesn't necessarily have to all be within us, but the world of the poem can dictate and create what needs to be there. But when we're writing from memory, it's important for us to really make sure that we're being honest, not just about the memory, but about what the memory means to us and how the reader can get that without being told how they're supposed to feel. And so those are the basic things that I want us to make sure we get from this. And he talks in here very well about anecdotal stories and how we can create a sense of things mattering for our reader without making them feel like they have to feel a certain way as we go through. So I've given you so many things that I want you to talk about. I should stop talking, or else I will end up with so many things I can't even keep track of them. But I would love in your responses below, you talk about some of these things that I've asked you to discuss and think about over the course of the 30 minutes you've been listening to me. So please deliver those down there. I also want to make sure that you get, and I've already posted this, the day-to-day calendar for the rest of the semester. I've had some people expressing some confusion on when we're meeting in class and when we meet on Canvas. That should have it cleared up pretty specifically, so hopefully we won't have any more concerns with that. If you're ever not sure, let me know. I know when I'm supposed to be meeting you, and I've done okay so far. I don't want to get cocky about that. But fortunately for me, I teach two alternating hybrid courses. So I'll be there each week, but if I have the right books, I guess that's another story. But if you ever have any questions or if you're ever confused, let me know, and I will be able to help you out with that. And I look forward to seeing your responses below. I won't see you in person until after spring break, so have a great spring break. Be safe, have fun with whatever you do. And until then, I look forward to hearing with your thoughts, more about your thoughts in regard to emotions and tone and diction and voice and our memories and how they can dictate what happens in a poem. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in the future.